y'all, I'm Laura Richardson with Relevate, and we're Real Estate Elevated. So today's episode is something I know you all are dying to hear about. How do you buy a farm? Well, first of all, we need to talk about, are you buying an existing farm or are you trying to build one from scratch? Obviously, in the day of HGTV and Chip and Joanna Gaines, a lot of folks want to do things like own their own chickens. However, when you start branching outside of even just the chicken realm and get into other animals, it can get a little bit more complicated. You have to think about a lot of factors. So first thing is access to the property. So if you think about building from scratch, what type of roadways do you have in order to access either the home site or the property itself? When you're dealing with dirt, gravel, or even paved roads, it's important to know who maintenances the road. Is it your responsibility? Is it a shared responsibility? Because if you're going to be taking any type of tractor trailers or heavy machinery and equipment in order to build, it's important that you know if you have to replace something or fix something should it get damaged in that process. The second thing is if you're buying an existing property that maybe used to have animals or plants on it, you need to know what was farmed there. Was it a certain type of crop and what was the last crop that was on there? This is going back to your maybe middle school, high school history days. It's really important when you're cultivating crops that you know what was recently planted because it takes certain things out of the soil. So you have to plant a different crop that's not going to take those same nutrients. This is called crop rotation. All right. So it's really important for those of us who are not ag majors to understand you have to rotate the things. So look at the back history and see what 3 crops the previous folks actually used to plant. Now, if you're switching to the animal realm here and talking about what types of things they had on the property, it's really important that you understand if you're going to have a different type of animal, what animal was there previously, because you have to think about what's currently in the soils, especially with runoff. So pigs are one of the major things that come to mind. Pig runoff is a really big deal. So if you're planning to have pigs, you need to make sure that you actually have permission to have those types of animals. So what do you want to farm? Figure that out in addition to looking at the back history. Another really important one that folks are not always aware of is deferred taxes. So the deferred tax program can actually be done for a couple different things. It can be done for planting, for farming of animals, or even forestry. And what that allows you to do is your property taxes are put in what's known as deferment, meaning you don't have to pay those. However, this is a government, done program. There's paperwork that goes through it, and there's also proof that these things are being done. You can't just say, oh, I'm in the tax deferment program and hope that nobody's checking on it. However, when you're selling or buying a property, so that transference of real property, you need to know if the previous person was in the deferment and if you are going to take it over and vice versa. The reason for that is when that transfer happens, if the next person is not going to continue to be a part of the program, it has to be paid off at closing. And it's not just that years, it's the past 3 years. So when you get to these sizable properties, it can be a nice little chunk of change. So that's always a good thing to kind of talk through and make sure you negotiate when you're doing your contract. The other thing is zoning. So if something is deemed residential versus agriculture, and then also you need to make sure that you're looking at ETJs. So when you have a city, there's still a zone outside the city where you kind of have to follow city rules even though you're in the rural space. Be really careful of noting where there's an ETJ. And then also look at that additional zoning, because if it's residential and you want to start a whole huge farm thing, somebody may have a problem with that. There's also volunteer agricultural districts that can also kind of come into play. So just make sure you're checking all of that, and obviously using town planning to your advantage. They can tell you whether something is permissible or not. So the other thing is usage to subdivide. I hear this one a lot, that folks want to buy a really large parcel. They're planning to farm maybe this front half, and then eventually they're going to sell that back half off to a builder. Well, first of all, you don't know if a builder really wants that, because is the land usable? And also if it's next door to a farm, sometimes that can kind of come into play. And then in addition to that, you also have to think about, are you even allowed to subdivide? There are actually some neighborhoods that are in Chapel Hill, for example, where they have to be 10 acres or more per lot. And that has to do with the water buffer that has to be allowable on those lots for buildings to then be constructed. So keep in mind, there might be a minimum amount of acreage that has to stay in place, and it could be pretty sizable. I think people really think that if it's an acre or smaller, you can kind of split it really however you want. But those larger parcels sometimes can come with more hoops and tricks that you kind of have to jump through. The other one, speaking of buffers, is a riparian buffer. We see these a lot because we have a ton of streams that kind of branch off from some of our major lakes and systems here. So you want to make sure if you're in the watershed that you're getting permission to actually disturb the soils, because think about it like this. Anytime an environment gets shifted, there are ramifications for the things that actually live in that environment, as well as runoff that's going to go downstream. So you actually have to have permission from the environmental association in order to disturb that dirt for building your potential new farm or home site. So look at riparian buffers, because there's also typically a minimum amount of feet that you have to be away from those things. All of your site plans are going to have to get approved to make sure that you are following protocols so that you're not causing a situation way down the road that maybe you can't even see. And then obviously structures for housing. Double check covenants, because this is a tricky one. Sometimes you're allowed to have certain types of animals, but the structure that you plan on putting them in has to have either certain like features or size, where it's placed on the property. There could be specific rules, and maybe that doesn't match what you're hoping to do on that particular site. So a lot of research goes into this, but if you're working with a talented agent that understands buying land, especially buying farmland, it can be such a fruitful, pun intended, opportunity for you and your family. Again, I'm Laura Richardson with Relevate, and we will see you next time.